to get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to this seminar/webinar. This is part of the Labour Studies Seminar Series, LSSS, which, as the Neo-Agate Labour Studies Unit, we run in partnership with the departments of economics and economic history and sociology and industrial sociology. So the idea here with labor studies is to be fairly broad. When we talk about labor studies, this is quite a broad, diverse understanding. It can be anything from understanding something about the history of unions and strikes to looking at labor markets to looking at social policy issues. But broadly speaking, our interest is in working people, poor people, and the larger society in which they live and survive, and how this society changes. And we're interested in changes as well. So we don't have a particular shared view on everything, and that's fine too. Disagreement is healthy, and Mike and I probably agree on 50% of things, disagree on 50% of things. That's what we're all about. All right. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Prof. Mike Rogan. Anyone here from economics? Oh man, all right. So I better tell you who he is. He was one of the first members of the Neo-Agate Labour Studies Unit. He's incredibly prolific in terms of publishing. He's just started a new project now, which he'll be heading up, and that's looking at earnings thresholds. Basically, it's kind of a complicated thing, but what is the line at which you draw where people get overtime or they don't get overtime, get time and a half, and so on? Probably most of you are not going to get overtime in your jobs, depending on this guy's research. Yes, a joke. All right. Anyway, he's associate prof in economics and economic history. He's active in the Neo-Agate Labour Studies Unit. He's an honorary research fellow at the HSRC's Education and Skills Development Research Program. And I should say that some of his work, which is very relevant to a lot of you, were graduate traces studies. What actually happens to people after they graduate? Who gets jobs? How long does it take to get jobs? And what's the impact of the institution that you're in? To some extent your qualifications, but also demography. All right, he's a research associate at the Global Research Policy Action Network, WIGO, which is Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. His PhD and Masters are from UKZN, and his BA is from the University of Washington in Seattle. And despite the accent, he's actually from the Eastern Cape originally. So there's that. Okay, Mike, I'm not going to say much more. The format is simply that the presenter will talk to the issues for 30 to 40 minutes or so. Mike's got a whole bunch of quick slides. So as you go along, you've got any questions, anything you want clarified, anything you want to dispute, all of that's fine. Just keep them, and then towards the end, we will, after he wraps up, we will take bunches of questions, engagements, and so on. And again, please, fair amount of people here are students. Don't be shy. Don't leave it to all the old people. Guys are up and coming bright sparks. So let's hear from you. All right. So without further ado, Mike, the show is yours. There will also be a recorded version of this released as a podcast and as a YouTube video will drop in about 2 weeks. So if there's anything particular, and I'm sure Mike will be very happy to chat to any of you afterwards if you want articles or anything like that. Okay, thanks very much. Mike.
Good. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming this afternoon. That's literally everything you can know about me. So thanks, Lucian. Am I okay with sound balance for the people online?
Yes, it's fine.
Great. And thanks to those of you who joined online. And also a big thanks to the Frederick Ebert Stiftung, which is our partner in this seminar series, and we really value their support for being able to do this type of thing on campus. So yeah, let me get straight into what I'm going to talk about today. I've just come back from Ghana, where I was based for several weeks. I've been involved in a project that's been going on for several years, looking at informal sector firms in Ghana, how they operate, how they're structured, and in particular, how they fit into the tax system in Ghana. So Ghana is an interesting context. You may or may not be aware that in South Africa, about 20% of workers are in the informal sector, and about 30% of workers in total are informal. So less than a third of our workforce is informal. In Ghana, 90% of the workforce is informal. So there's a huge difference in the structure of our labor markets. And whenever we talk about informal economies or the informal sector, we typically look at Ghana as one of the sort of key examples, largely based on the size of its informal sector. So just a bit about this project. It's in partnership with all of these people down here. Several of them are from the International Center for Tax and Development, which is based at the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Sussex in the UK. They're part of the funding team that made this possible, and my fellow co-authors. This project is a firm survey. We look to draw a representative sample of informal sector firms in Ghana's capital, Accra. And so we needed to work with the same type of people who work on the census or the labor force survey in the country. So we partnered with the Institute for Social and Statistical and Economic Research at the University of Ghana, who work closely with the Ghana Statistical Agency to run these particular type of surveys. We were after a representative survey of firms in Ghana. The work is funded by Swedish SIDA from our side. So they were interested in a longer term project about taxes and social protection. That's where this fit in. I, together with one of my colleagues, Dr. Laura Elfers, also from NALSU, and as Lucien mentioned, are part of this global research and advocacy network, which is concerned with the livelihoods of people in informal employment in a number of countries around the world. So this sort of mixture of partners and funders was interested in this particular study and trying to answer some of the questions that we thought were missing from key debates. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the context, the study, some of our key results, and then what we think it means and what we're planning to do next with this particular project. So the background has been burning for a while, and this is why Ghana is an interesting example. If 90% of the workforce is in the informal sector, where do your domestic resources come from? We depend on things like VATs, PAYE, income tax, and corporate tax to fund government expenditure. So what do you do if 90% of your workforce is informal? That's the conundrum that Ghana faces, similar to many other countries, but it is the quintessential example of the informal economy. So Ghana for years has been implementing policies. The most recent was Ghana Beyond Aid, really trying to ramp up domestic resource mobilization. And through much of that, they painted the informal sector as a group that's not contributing to the tax base. Much of this was based on relatively loose assumptions and occasionally sort of back of the envelope type of calculations, how much tax they thought they should be getting versus how much tax they were getting. But they were missing the sort of empirical basis, the ground up information to try and figure out where taxes come from and where they don't come from. Then COVID came along, and governments really, particularly lower income countries, really needed funds to basically fund the stimulus and recovery packages. And countries across the continent, there are about 16 so far, have been aggressively targeting the informal sector as a source of more tax revenues. I don't know if some of you come from these types of countries. One of the most popular means of doing this is to institute an e-levy. Those of you from East Africa will know M-Pesa. It's where you transfer funds on your cell phone, putting taxes on those and siphoning off a portion of each transaction to the revenue authority. So we've written several papers about this in Ghana so far, but basically the intensity of efforts to get funds from the informal sector has really increased in the past couple of years, and COVID has made this even worse. But as I mentioned, we don't really have evidence on whether and how much informal sector operators in these different countries actually do contribute. We can assume that they pay VAT, right? Because we all pay VATs on goods and services. It's relatively inescapable. But can we come up with a taxation system that makes sense from the perspective of the informal sector? Well, where do you get that information? How do you figure out how much they should be paying and how much they are paying? There's no real source of information. You can only look at the revenue authority and get one number, but you don't understand really where it comes from. And I should say that Ghana does have a tax system for the informal sector. It's called the presumptive tax system. Most countries in sub-Saharan Africa have something similar to that. It's where instead of taking a portion of your income, you make a presumption about how much different types of informal sector workers might be making, and you tax an amount based on that. So if you're thinking in your head, that sounds very unscientific and very loose, it is, right? And it often leads to unfair sort of tax practices. So Ghana has a presumptive tax system, so we knew that we could try and measure that, but we needed an informal sector survey that was representative of population of workers, which is what we set out to do, to try and get some sort of data point to allow us to say something about taxation. We can also say a lot more. We can come up with numbers and we can debate and discuss those numbers, but we can also say a lot about who pays and how fair a tax system is and what the link is between tax systems, tax fairness, and other outcomes in terms of civic participation, different types of political outcomes. And this is what we're trying to do in our survey. As I mentioned, it's a partnership between the University of Ghana, the University of Sussex, Rhodes University, through our participation in this network, NIGO. And what I'm going to present today is really just our first round of analysis, right? We had some basic questions that we were seeking answers for, and I'm going to just show you sort of a run through of what we found so far, or initially, as we sort of developed the analysis further. So just a little about the data. We collected this in April and May of last year. So we worked with the University of Ghana to implement this survey. It took about 2 months to collect what is essentially a combination of a firm survey or an enterprise survey, if you're familiar with those, a labor force survey, and a political attitude type survey. So we were able to design this instrument and collect data from about 2,700 informal sector operators. And we also modeled it closely on the sampling frame and the criteria for inclusion from Ghana's labor force survey, and worked with some of the same people who execute the labor force survey. We used a probability based design. That was the intention from the beginning, is if you're going to make arguments to the revenue authority, you need data that's representative. So this is statistically representative of the greater Accra area. So we used the ward boundaries and the enumeration areas to draw a clustered sample from all of the different areas in the greater Accra Metropolitan Assembly, as they'll call it. So when you do something like this, I don't know if you're kind of thinking how big this is in your head. It costs a lot of money, which the Swedish people were very kind to help us with. But it becomes quite tense, because what if you get it wrong? And you sort of only find out if you get it wrong after you've collected the data. It has to be representative of your sample, otherwise it's not very useful. So I posted here just a few sort of descriptive statistics about the type of people that we interviewed. And the thing that sort of gave us quite a bit of comfort was that it's closely aligned with the results from the National Labor Force Survey. So our survey does share a lot of characteristics with the labor force survey, which means it's also a good approximation of the population that we were trying to study, which is informal sector firms in the capital city. So much like the labor force survey, the vast majority of our sample are own account workers, 61.3% and 22.5%. Own account means you work on your own. You're self-employed, you're informal, and you don't have any employees. So we've all seen people like street vendors and market traders, people like that we refer to as own account. They tend to be the most vulnerable, and the proxy for that is they don't have enough money to be able to successfully hire someone else. They're just working on their own. About 16.3% are employers, slightly higher than in the labor force survey. This means that you're still self-employed, but you have enough work, or you're productive enough that you need help and you hire at least one other person that's not a family member. And these are the types of firms that we often focus on when we think about taxation. The sample is predominantly women, just over 70%. We were uncomfortable with this, but every way we twisted it, it matched up with the labor force survey. There's still a question about where are the men. On the way to the airports last week, we stopped at one of the largest markets in Accra, and we walked around, and we noticed that not only were there no men trading, we seemed to be the only men. There were two of us in the group, 2 men and 2 women. We seemed to be the only men in the market, which was the oddest sensation. So this number seems unbelievable, but it matches the labor force survey and opens up some other questions which we still can't answer, which is where are the men? We could identify 3 main groups that we were trying to get specific information about because they pay their taxes differently and have different relationships with the state. Street vendors made up about 23.9, so just under a quarter of the sample. We all kind of have an idea of what street vendors are, right? You can kind of picture that in all of our cities. This is quite a large group compared to other African countries. These are home-based workers. About 42% are home-based workers. This is quite a broad range. Sometimes it's people cooking things and selling things from their home. Sometimes it's people that are engaged in different types of manufacturing activities. We typically associate it with the subcontinent, for example, India, where women make products for the garment industry. So the t-shirts we wear are actually sewn together by women in their households and then passed back through the garment factories. But home-based work means something slightly different in Ghana. It's a very diverse category, but it means you're based in your home doing some type of productive activity. And then Ghana is well known for its very vibrant and colorful markets. There's something like 65 extremely large markets just in the Accra metropolitan assembly. So these are the 3 main groups. It's not the total sample. There's another group which I'll refer to as other throughout my presentation. These are largely, this is where the men do appear. These are largely store-based informal businesses. So different types of what we would call spaza shops, or different types of informal shops that basically aren't registered as companies, but operate in public spaces, usually in sort of fixed premises. So the funder and to a large extent ourselves was interested in both sides of the tax equation. Right? Tax is what you give to the state, and then the other side of the equation is what you get for your tax money. We think of water and electricity here, right? It comes to mind time to time here in Grantstown. So for the traders, people in the markets, home-based workers, they're looking for things like social protection, basic services. And in this particular moment, when we conducted the survey, it was right after the pandemic. So what type of state support did they get in terms of COVID relief, right? Here we have the social relief of distress grant. They had similar grants for small and micro businesses in Ghana. So what does the informal sector get in return for the taxes and payments that they make? So we start by looking at this particular side of the equation, and I'll come back to at the end why this is perhaps relevant in the design of better tax systems. So first, we start with the good news. The National Health Insurance Scheme is often referred to as the flagship health program on the continent. It's often sort of awarded through your employer, but for those who are in the informal sector, there's an opportunity to pay a state subsidized contribution per month, which allows you access to the scheme. And it's generally considered to be something which gives you access to high quality healthcare, but you do pay for it, but it's largely subsidized and therefore a nominal fee. This is also a good moment to talk a little bit about the structure of this graph. Most of the graphs are presented this way. On the left side here, I've got the sample of men, much smaller sample. And on the right side, I've got the sample of women from our survey. For both women and men, you can see 5 columns. Typically, when we analyze things like earnings and contributions and tax, we break down the sample into income or earnings quintiles. So quintile 1 is the lowest earning group. Quintile 5 is the highest earning group. So we can look at the distribution of earnings. This group here is quintile 1 amongst men. they earn the least amount. Quintile 5 earns the most out of the male sample. So this graph here shows the proportion of our sample by gender and earnings quintile, which has access or is a member of the NHIS. And if you can see here, across the quintiles, roughly 70% of women are members of this health scheme. So we see that as a fairly positive outcome. It's subsidized by the state. And as you can see, the group that has the highest membership in the national health scheme is the lowest earning group. So the poorest workers in the informal economy are the most likely to be members of the state national health insurance scheme. Can you see the much lower membership numbers or percentages for men there? Men seem less likely to be members of this scheme, but you can see that the shape is the same. Those in the lower earning groups, the 3 bars on the left, something like 55% of those lower earning groups of men are members, and then the higher earning groups go down to about 38%. So we call this the good news from the social protection side of our survey, and perhaps has lessons that we could draw on at the end. Here's the bad news. This SSNIT stands for the Social Security something something, but this is the National Pension Plan. This is a voluntary contributory scheme which allows you to save for your retirement. And the numbers are quite small, but the two things you can spot even at a distance are that men are much more likely to be members of this retirement scheme relative to women. So less than 10% of women are members of this scheme, whereas close to 20% of men are members of this scheme. And there's certainly no pattern by earnings group. The wealthier are just as likely or unlikely to be members of this scheme. We also asked questions about other types of retirement programs, and it was generally the case that if you weren't a member of the national scheme, you weren't contributing towards your retirement. We spent about a day when we were in Accra with the Ghana Trade Union Congress, and this is something that really bothers them, the low take-up, particularly amongst informal workers in Ghana. It leaves a large chunk of the workforce without protection or anything to support them when they become older. But the idea is both of these are voluntary contributory schemes, and can you see the big difference that these workers opt into the health scheme, but not into the pension scheme? But both, we would argue, are to some extent subsidized by the state. So we call this last bit the really bad news. So I mentioned the SRD in South Africa. In Ghana, we had a program called CAPBUS. Can't remember what that stands for either. But it was a grant to provide relief to small, medium, and micro enterprises to help them get through the COVID pandemic. The pandemic wasn't quite as severe in Ghana as it was here in South Africa, but still a lot of people lost their jobs and the economy more or less tanked over the pandemic period. So there was this relief program to which you could apply. This was extended. The idea was to make sure that the informal sector and women in the informal sector in particular were included. And this is what happened. The blue bars are the percentage of our sample, again, by earnings quintiles that applied. So you can see that only 12% of the lowest earnings workers even applied for this scheme. The highest percentage was about 18%. It was the fourth quintile. But basically, the three higher earning groups were significantly more likely to apply. So not many people applied for this scheme. They gave lots of different reasons. Frustration with the application process. It was too complicated. They didn't think that they would be successful. They were right that they weren't successful. You see these little red bars here. Those are the percentages of each earnings quintile that actually received the grant. The numbers are tiny there, but all of these are at the lower end are less than 1% of the total sample received any support from government through the scheme that was designed to reach them. The most was just about 1% amongst these top groups here. So this group was really left out of the sort of main support scheme for workers in the Ghanaian labor market. This was designed for them, in part, at least wasn't designed to exclude them. And we don't really focus on this much more, apart to say that this was a moment when there was a real need for state collaboration, for state support, and that opportunity was missed from the perspective of the informal sector. They were very much left to sort of fend for themselves during the crisis. Okay, so if we kind of park that for now, and we can come back to it a little bit later on what that means in lieu of their taxes, we can also look at the other side of the ledger now. What do they actually contribute? How much do they pay? Should they be paying more? Is it true that they're paying nothing, as the Revenue Authority often claims? So it turns out that it's fairly difficult to be precise about this, because taxes come in many forms and they're paid to different actors. Sometimes they're paid locally, sometimes they're paid nationally, and sometimes they're not called taxes, but that's what they actually are. They may not have the word tax in them, but they're paid just like any other tax. So we came up with a conservative estimate. We found that about 2/3 of our entire sample paid at least one type of tax or payment. And this was made to either the local government, the city government, or the Ghana Revenue Authority. So this is a far cry from the argument of government, which is that they're non-taxpayers. So 2/3, using the most conservative measure possible, are some type of taxpayer already. Overall, because of the design of the multiple tax systems, these payments are highly regressive. And if you don't know what that means, it means it's the opposite of progressive. When you pay your taxes in any country, there's almost one primary quality of a good tax system. It's that the more you earn, the more you pay. So you pay a higher proportion of your earnings, the more you earn. Regressive is the opposite. It's where the lower your earnings, the higher proportion of your earnings you pay. It's considered unfair for a reason, right? It's not a sustainable tax system if it's regressive. Overall, we find a lot of evidence of regressivity in the types of payments and taxes that the informal sector workers pay. But we need to break it down into several different types or categories of payments. So we start with business licenses and operating fees. These are paid on a schedule based on what the municipal government thinks your turnover might be and where you work in the city, what type of public space you work. So there's something like a 330-page schedule with all different types of activities, what you sell, what you make, where you work, how big your operation is, that determines what your operating or license fee should be. And this is paid to the Accra Municipal Assembly. So the way I've expressed these, again, these are the men here. These are the women here. This is the lowest earning quintile amongst men. This is the highest. This is the lowest among women. This is the highest among women here. So if this was progressive, it means as the graph goes to the right, these bars should be higher, meaning people who earn more pay a larger share of their money towards these licenses and fees. So here at the bottom, the lowest earning group of men pays about 4%, and the lowest earning fifth of women pay about 2%, and it goes down the more you earn. This is what we mean by a regressive structure. And just to give you a sense, the median earnings amongst these low groups are about 600 to 650 Rand per month. That's what they earn. That's what they actually take home. So just as in South Africa, in Ghana, that group isn't expected to pay any taxes. Why should they? They only earn 650 Rands a month. It's not feasible. So if we just start with these types of fees, already we can see that most people pay something, and the structure of these fees and licenses are highly regressive. So that doesn't even include the things that we formally call taxes, right? Things that might even have the word tax in them. Once we do that, and by the way, I haven't mentioned this, but there's a report or a working paper based on this presentation. So if anyone's interested, we can provide a link to that. It's probably even on the website. And it goes into a lot of detail about what these different types of payments are that I'm showing in the graph. So if you're really interested, make access to the report possible. So these are the things that are strictly referred to as taxes. And these are again expressed as a share of monthly earnings. So this is separate from the previous slide. This is in addition to those payments that I reported in the previous slide. But you can see the same structure. Here, this lowest earning group is paying 3% and 4% for men and women respectively of their earnings towards taxes. But you kind of have to keep track because this is on top of the previous slide. So we're already up to about 7%, right? Their earnings for the lowest group. So not only does the amount that they have to pay get larger with each type of payment, but it becomes more aggressive because they're just these payments and fees and taxes are stacking up on top of each other. There's another group, which I'm not going to put in the same slide, but you can imagine it looks the same way. These are user fees and informal taxes. So about 16% of our sample pays at least one user fee to the local government to operate their business. This might be to get access to a public space, a stall, a position in a market, some type of rental. What we're not including are service fees, fees for water, electricity, and sanitation. So we're not even counting that type of stuff. If we add that in, it means 95% of our sample pays some sort of fee or tax to some level of government. In other countries, we have things like informal taxes, and that often comes when you work in an area where there's a traditional authority. Surprisingly, we don't find that in Ghana. We've done similar work in Sierra Leone, where informal taxes paid to a traditional authority are a significant portion of taxes. But in Ghana, at least in Accra, this doesn't seem to be a feature. But if we add this 16% onto the total, we're starting to get to a large tax burden, sort of aggregate, if you will, across the different types of payments. So this is our now overall graph where we add up all these different things. Again, this is a fairly conservative estimate, and keep in mind it doesn't say anything about VAT, nothing about value added tax, which workers obviously pay. Also think about traders who have to pay VAT on the goods that they sell on. So this is what it looks like for women and men. It's fairly similar. So let's just look at women. That lowest earning group of women, again, earning about 650 Rand a month, pays nearly 10% of their earnings towards these different taxes and fees just to be able to conduct their business. The next group pays 6%. The next group pays 4%, 3%, and then 1%. Right? So the first thing is, this is the opposite of the way a sustainable tax system is structured. It's highly regressive. You can imagine what tax morale is like in these particular contexts. For those who don't know what's been happening in Ghana for the last year and a half, inflation was something like, headline inflation was something like 57% year on year. If you ever visit Ghana, everything you pay for feels like Cape Town plus in terms of costs. Everything feels about 30% more than Cape Town. You guys been to Cape Town? Painful. Not Grahamstown prices. It's a really expensive country. Inflation is basically running away. Economic growth has dried up. They've taken the bailout from the IMF, which puts constraints on public expenditure. So this is actually a pretty scary graph. I mean, it looks somewhat benign, but the point is that it's essentially the opposite of what's been happening compared to the claims made by the revenue authority. If you want to design a tax system to get more funds out of the informal sector, this is the baseline with which you're working. This is the existing tax structure. You can break it down a little bit further by seeing which groups pay which type of taxes. So these columns are the exact same height as the previous slide. Just shows how we get to that 10%. So the blue one are things called formal taxes that everyone would agree are taxes. The red are taxes in every way but name. This green bar here are the user fees. So you have to pay these in order to do your job to the same people you pay your taxes to. And then this is that small bit that I said wasn't as much a factor in Ghana as it is in other contexts. So you can see how the composition of taxes changes quite a bit as you go through the different earnings groups. The biggest group of largest single group of payments comes from formal taxes. So these are things that are recognized by the revenue authority. And then this other group comes from local taxes. So you can see there's quite a split on who you actually pay your taxes to. So the GRA designs, the Ghana Revenue Authority designs tax policy, but it's completely blind to the taxes that are paid at the municipal level. That's why these taxes end up getting stacked on top of each other. We can look at it a slightly different way. A good tax system should be relatively even as well. That means that people of the same earnings level should pay roughly the same amount. So these are these quintiles for men and women again, but these box plots show the distribution. So this box plot here is directly comparable to the slide earlier where we showed that between 9 and 10% of the lowest earning group paid about, the lowest earning group paid about 9 to 10% of their earnings in taxes and operating fees. What this shows is for the lowest earning group, that extended all the way up to 50%. The highest amount that someone in the lowest earning group paid was 50% of their earnings in taxes and fees. And what you should see from this graph is how dispersed the different effective tax rates are for each group. So not only does this group pay way more in tax than the higher earning groups, but there's a lot more variation in the types of payments or the level of payments they make. This is a box plot, so the bottom of the box denotes the 25th percentile. The line in the middle denotes the median, which is pretty close to 9%. And the 75th percentile pays about a quarter of their earnings in taxes, right? So this is not a firm foundation for building a tax system which sort of facilitates a relationship between state and society. So what does all this mean? So about 3 weeks ago, we had a webinar with the OECD, which has a tax program within its economic unit. And they're doing a project also funded in part by Swedish SIDA, where they're trying to do a scan of all the different tax systems for developing countries to try and identify how people tax or how different countries tax their informal economies. So we've been working with them to try and think through how Ghana fits into this and how we can sort of collaborate to get better ideas of tax design. And one of the points that they've made is perhaps the best way to do this is to link tax registration with Social Security. Remember that graph where very few people were involved with the state pension, and there was still room to improve access to the health scheme. What if we tied those two things together? And what we're saying is Ghana is an example of where those two things are quite separate. The tax net is already pretty tight, but the safety net is pretty loose, right? Workers are on their own, but they're certainly contributing more than their expected share in taxation. This pressure to tax the informal sector comes from an assumption which is not very realistic, which is that the informal sector isn't paying any taxes. This is some of the sort of findings that I've shared today are fairly modest, but the point is these are the only data we have on how taxes are structured in the informal sector. But we need to rethink this pressure to tax the informal sector. We often call it the hidden gold mine. Like there's money out there that's just waiting to be sort of drawn into the revenue coffers, but that's clearly not the case, especially when you consider earnings. And if we are going to tax them differently, it can't be regressive. You have to have a progressive tax system. That's the only way that these things can be sustainable. So some of the points we agreed on with the OECD, who is in favor of presumptive taxation on the whole, is that you can't design a tax system unless you understand the current structure of taxation. even if that means you have to scrap the current system and streamline to make one tax system. It's a recipe for an unsustainable tax system when different actors are taxing the same people and are unaware of the taxes that they're extracting. So the literature calls this the devil's deal. And it basically describes a downward spiral in the relations between states and labor in particular. And we can call labor, the informal sector, labor in Ghana. It's 90% of the workforce. And the way it works is we don't pay taxes because we don't get services or anything. And we don't get services or anything because we don't pay taxes. And you get this downward spiral, which is called the devil's deal. That comes from layering taxes on top of each other and highly regressive tax structures, which essentially destroy tax morale. So the question we want to deal with next in our project in Ghana is, how do you break the devil's deal? If it's a downward spiral, you've got to arrest that spiral somewhere. So we've got some ideas on how we can design some research that help us get to that first step. What do you actually do? Because people get tired of listening to people like me describe the problem. What do you do next? And we're not denying that Ghana needs resources, right? All governments, all states need resources. But a lot of damage has been done. How do you arrest that downward spiral? We don't have the answers yet. And I'm not saying we're completely opposed to the idea of presumptive taxation, but the question that's open is, can it be done better? And that's where the partnership with the OECD is useful. They've come up with 50 best practices in the design of a presumptive tax regime. It's designed for the informal sector. Two of the ideas that I think we like the best are, what about registration for tax without payments? So what if that lowest 20% really shouldn't be taxed anything? If anything, they should be receiving the report. What if they registered for tax but didn't have to pay any tax? And what if that registration for tax was linked to the social security system to get a more streamlined approach? That way, the people who need to contribute could contribute, but those people that need support could actually receive support. Would that be a way of arresting or intervening in the devil's deal? So in terms of next steps, we thought long and hard about what we'd like to do next. We've got about half the funding that we need to do the next part of the study. And essentially what we want to do is we want to model or implement a social protection intervention in partnership with government. And then we want to study the effects of that intervention on tax morale to see if that helps us to break this devil's deal where labor has given up on the state and state doesn't provide anything to labor. We want to see if we can just put some sort of change in that sort of two-way sort of downward spiral. So there's a large literature in economics called services first. And the idea is you first show some goodwill by providing this service or social protection, and then you study in a sort of randomized controlled trial whether that has any impact on either what you pay or your willingness to pay tax. So we think we want to take this closer to a solution and see which of these best practices, which have recently been published in the tax literature, might actually be the way forward. And I think the danger is if we keep presenting problems the way I've done, we can easily be dismissed, right? Because we need taxes, we need domestic resources, and in particular, we need it for things like social protection and infrastructure and services. So the question we want to pivot to is, how do we do it better? What I've focused on today is what we have to know about how we've done it badly in the past before we sort of move forward. But I think our discussion, hopefully, and research focus going forward will be what's the best way for an economy like Ghana, which has an informal sector, which is in large part the same size as the workforce as a whole. Great, so that's what I've got, and keen to hear your thoughts as well.
So what we normally do here is we take a couple of questions, like a round, and we give it to the speaker, and they can respond, and we do 1 or 2 or 3 rounds like that. I would just like to say thanks very much for doing this, and I think often when you hear about tax or social security, but it's actually something that's very relevant to labor. I mean, South Africa's got a very different system with a very different history, both of taxation and of social protection. So we have a lot of things that are non-contributory, but are, for example, means tested, like an old age pension. I think one of the other things here that shaped that history, and this is something for sociologists here to bear in mind, is the social structure and the power relations. So a lot of the history of our old age pension goes back actually to a political party which died off in the 50s called the South African Labour Party, which was basically the party that organized white labor, white workers set up. And they didn't want work. Their position was, we don't want to pay, it's non-contributory, we are not going to pay for our own pensions. Government must tax people and then we should get it. But because of our history, these were also racialized. So the amount of pension you got varied by race, but also by whether you are homeland or in the cities. So there's a lot of interesting stuff to think about. This is also very quantitative, which I think it shows the power of that method, especially when you've got somebody who articulates it very well. So let's see, are there any questions here? Yes, I'll take a few hands and then I'll point you out. And if you can just give your name and where you're from to start. Okay, noted you. I've noted you and I've noted you. Is there four? Okay, let's start with you.
I'm really not computer science. So I mean, given what you mentioned, the spiraling kind of inflation, 57% year on year, one would assume that that would also be a larger component of what they have to pay, and a larger component of the income of the country. I wasn't sure, would that be under the formal taxes counted where they have to pay that? Because would that at least partially explain the kind of enormous amount that the quintile one pays? Because of course you need to have stock to sell something. If you don't have stock, you kind of, that's it for you. Yeah, so that was my question.
Thank you very much. I'll go to you next.
It's not be a silly question or something, but you mentioned that with the COVID relief systems, whatever, it was meant for the informal employees, right? But why is there such a large gap, or maybe do you know why there's such a large gap between those who applied and those who actually received the relief?
Not a silly question. Questions are also how we learn, and disagreement debate, all important parts of the process. Noted you.
Yeah, Rogan, I see that when you say that 90% of the workforce is in the informal sector, I can see the importance of the government having to tax that sector, because that's where economic activity is. But and then this is in view of you saying that there's 7% of that 90% is mostly women. So my question is, what's the age group of the people that are operating in that sector? And seeing the regressiveness of the tax system, what does the government do when people default and not pay these various tax categories?
Very interesting.
Well, yeah. Let me say again, Bachelor of Social Science students. About the social impact that like with all those statistics that you provide, does it go spiral down with the whole economic system? Because I mean, paying taxes, there's no real growth, considering that that's why the inflation rate is so high.
Mark, have you got enough on your plate?
Yeah. All right. Yeah, the VAT is the elephant in the room. So none of my estimates include VAT at all. And that's for two reasons. The one is the whole VAT side of revenue is different from direct taxes. There are really separate debates about whether VAT is progressive or regressive, or rather whether it can be made progressive. The exemptions we have for basic goods, most countries have those types of things. So it's not a fun debate. It's a real number crunching type of debate. But can you make VAT so that it works? So that, let's say, you tax luxury goods rather than bread and maize and sugar and tea and things like that, right? That's the sort of realm of debate. The other thing is the data for that. If we wanted to include VAT in our survey, we would have had to have expenditure diaries where we send people home for a month at a time, where they record what they buy and how much they pay and how many people use those goods that they buy. So it becomes a completely different sort of data exercise, but also the policies that are often pursued, whether it's e-levies for electronic transactions or presumptive tax regimes, they're completely separate from that. VAT is seen as a thing which exists and will always exist to try and make it more progressive. But what we want to do is tap this gold mine, which we can only get through sort of direct taxes. So yeah, I mean, a lot of the argument that people make is, well, of course they pay tax, they pay indirect tax. But this is over and above those contributions to VAT. We could probably come up with some sort of estimate, but then we'd be entering that literature which looks at whether and how VAT can be made progressive. And I think we're kind of debating whether that's our place or whether there are enough people kind of doing that, and frankly, whether we have the appetite to just sit down with spreadsheets for 6 or 7 months to come up with a good number that makes sense. But it's a worthwhile question, because if you follow some of the tax and development literature, particularly the World Bank, they're very big on VAT as the solution to the very low tax to GDP ratio that most of our neighbors have. Probably the best question is, what about the gap between people who applied and people who received? So you saw in some categories, roughly 15% of the workers in that income group applied and less than 1% received. So we also didn't quite understand that. So we did some focus groups, and a lot of people just said they applied and never heard back. Some people received notification, and this was streamlined, so you could do it on your phone. It was designed so that people without a tax slip or a pay slip could apply. But basically, what we think happens is that on paper, this was rolled out to the informal sector, but in practice, it was there's micro, macro, and small enterprises. It was aimed at 2 of those, not the third one. And of course, the tragedy is most people work in that third category. We saw that the large majority of our sample were own account workers, right? They just work for themselves. They were led to believe they were part of the relief package, but in fact, their applications were seemingly dismissed out of hand. And I think that was a moment where the devil's deal could have been sort of bridged a little bit. That would have been a moment when, because I mean, how often does that happen? When the state shuts down a country and then you rely on the state to give you support, right? That doesn't happen often. So that was a moment where an opportunity was lost to build a bit of goodwill there. So what about the age group? That's a good question. We've got that in various places. We could look that up, but I don't think there was anything particularly, no, we don't have it in this graph. There was nothing that stood out for us about the age group. And in some countries like ours, with a small informal sector, the informal workforce tends to be a bit older, and we have high youth unemployment. But in a context like Ghana that has a dominant informal sector and low unemployment, basically your workforce looks much like your working age population. So it's pretty evenly distributed. Maybe a little bit older just because of firm survival. More successful people stick with it. But there's no choice in Ghana, right? There's the informal sector. So the age distribution is very similar to the working age population. But we could easily be more specific about that if it interests you. Yeah, so there was a great question about default, and we actually included some questions in the survey about what happens if you don't pay, or why you pay, what you're afraid of happening if you don't pay. And so it depends on the type of tax. We were sort of saying that it's interesting that only 10% of the workforce is formal. It feels to us when we're in the markets that 10% are tax collectors, because these guys walk around the markets with big books and they give you stamps. So when you pay your daily tax or your quarterly permits or your annual income tax, you get a stamp. In fact, the income tax is called a stamp. So you have to show that proof of payments. Otherwise, any number of things can happen. There's what can happen to you legally. You can receive a fine. But what do you think actually happens to people? Right? They get harassed, abused, their goods confiscated, moved out of their space. Someone else takes their space, and there is an extreme lack of goodwill between tax collectors and the informal sector, particularly in markets where people keep their stock, right?
So the tax is physically collected.
Physically collected, yeah. I would say that there's discussions about streamlining it, doing it online, but they've been saying that for so long that it seems unlikely. So another big question is, what about leakage? These people come and collect, but how much makes it back to them?
Exactly.
So people have a lot to say about that. And keep in mind that a lot of the accusations of lack of tax payment come from the revenue authority, who are counting what their collectors bring back to them as well. So how do you think people feel about that? So interestingly, some informal workers were happy with the e-levy, which is the 1.5% tax on any transaction you make by your mobile phone. Why do you think they were happy with that?
Seems honest and you want to be cheated on.
You know where it goes, right? No one comes to collect it. It just gets sort of transferred directly to the revenue authority. So some people were in favor, but not many people. But that was the one appealing thing about it, is it didn't seem to struggle with this leakage. And then, yeah, you know, a great question about inflation. And as many times as I visit Ghana, I never understand how people survive there. Prices are so high before inflation. So we were in the field, as you mentioned, April, May 2022. The headline inflation I mentioned was between 23 and 2022. When you go to the restaurants there, they often have stickers. You know, when you go across to the price of the burger, it's on the right. They put stickers on the burger price because they're going to have to put a new sticker on top of that. And how do you survive on 650 rand a month in a country where everything's more expensive than South Africa? We all know you wouldn't survive on 650 rand a month in South Africa. So we've also abstained from calling this group the wealthiest group. Right, this is the highest earning quintile. This group earns about 6,000 rand a month. So that's the top end of our informal sector. That is a little bit less than the entry salary in Ghana for like a teacher, a first-year teacher, or a first-year nurse. So I would love to understand how any country can talk about headline inflation. So I sent to my economics colleagues a snap of the paper the day I arrived that said, headline inflation eases to 45%. And my Zimbabwean colleagues said, well, it's not too bad. But what, you know, we talk about the numbers we're generating, and we're also trying to come up with some bigger numbers that we can actually say, this is what we expect to go in the coffers. But what occurred to us is April and May 2022 is ancient history in terms of prices, right? And inflation like that sort of happens. But it seems like a very, very tough place to scratch out a living in Ghana, and particularly when the other interesting feature, which doesn't help explain how people survive there, the gap between the poverty line and the income tax threshold, in other words, how much you should be earning before you start owing to the revenue authority, is very, very tight. So what I mean by that is, if you kind of do the average math on how many people with salary support, as soon as you have enough to be above the poverty line, you almost immediately start being eligible for tax. So their tax threshold is very low in Ghana. Even amongst formal workers, you do pay tax at a much lower level than we do in South Africa. Right? In South Africa, what's it, about 80,000? You have to earn at least 80,000 before you're eligible for tax. In Ghana, it's much, much lower. So as soon as you clear the poverty threshold, you're in the tax sort of system. Of course, that's for the formal, that's the PAYE tax system. So how does that work with inflation? Would be follow the question too. It's mind-boggling. It's you can live there and you can spend time there and you just don't understand how it works. Which is why some of these numbers don't look like much in a graph, but when you translate that to the reality of earning a living and meeting the cost of living, it's quite startling.
Should they have like organizations with traders and people, or everybody's operating on their own?
It's a mixture. So the organization we work with, the network WeGo, aims to provide support to, we call them membership-based organizations, which are essentially informal trade unions. So markets tend to be better organized than street vendors, for example, and street vendors tend to be better organized than, for example, home-based workers, because they're you don't have the same connections to other groups. So yeah, and that's where the sort of collaboration with the Ghana Trade Union Congress comes in as well. Surely a Congress in a country where 90% of workers are informal has to be more sensitive about organizing the informal
guys.
Yeah.
I mean, your survey is also looking at the city, right? So there's a huge informal economy in the countryside.
Yeah.
And, sorry, we can take one last round of questions, I think, and I think we're also going to let Mike also wrap up with any final words there. Sorry, Valence.
Online question.
Sorry.
Online question. I'll read it out to Mike.
All right. So if you read out the moment, I just want to make a point here for people here from more like sociology and that sort of thing. It's a very different structure, right? Because here, most of the population in South Africa is wage dependent. So even when people are living in the countryside, they're often depending on wages coming from the cities. And then there's a social wage and the government giving a lot of grants. And a lot of those are sort of means tested and they're non-contributory. They don't check if you pay to the old age pension. They check your income level. Okay, but there are other ones that you pay in, which are more like insurance schemes, like when you buy your taxi fare, there's built into the taxi fare some taxes that I think go to the road accident fund. But the South African state is very good at collecting money. One estimate is 44% of the GDP goes into the state. So it's very, so I'm going to put a quick question, then I'll take some other hands. The one is, how is this affected first by the power relations? I mean, that was raised there. If these ordinary people aren't really organized, or if they are organized, what leverage do they have? I mean, a union can shut things. If these guys don't sell anything, they don't eat. So the one is around the question of power relations and do these guys have leverage on organized? Second one is the capacity of the state. I mean, is the Ghanaian state really designed to provide social protection, or is its limited capacity geared towards sucking money out of the country to those who work for the state? I noted a hand there. Okay, good. 1, 2, anyone going?
I can read out Jen's question.
And there's one online. All right, so I'm going to take you and then him, and then we will get Janet Cherry's.
It's a twofold concern. So I was reading speaking, and it says that Ghana has the most economically stable country in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a good way for you when majority of the population is informally employed. So how are they making their money? And then also, but then with that question, I sort of answer myself and I said, well, then the 10% is being overly taxed. And then isn't that then unfair on their part to be overly taxed? Like, as much as it's unfair to tax the informal employees who are already earning a low amount, but is it not then also unfair to overtax just 10% of the population?
Sorry, I was on something. Yes, please. Out of my arms.
I mean, it's actually a chance. I wanted to ask, are these numbers affected by the if they were half?
Yeah, it's actually Jen's question. So let me just read it out. I think it's a great question. Does our research have any lessons about how to tax the informal in sector in South Africa. And I wonder if people know how the informal sector is taxed in South Africa currently. So I can say something about that.
Oh, sorry, thanks for the correction. That's Jen Snowball.
Yeah.
Not Janet Cherry.
Yeah. Great. So what about leverage and power? It seems like it's just a long war of attrition between whether you call them traders, market traders, or the informal sector, and the relationship, which I would describe as largely extractive between the states. So in our survey, we have lots of different questions about perceptions and relations with the state, but we're careful to look at different levels of the state. Because there's a very different relationship with the municipal assembly versus the national government, and of course the revenue authority. So taxes are an issue, but one of the biggest issues recently, and this was still ongoing when I was in Ghana a couple of weeks ago, was the removal of traders from public spaces. So just like in South Africa, they called it something like Operation Clean Sweep or Clean Streets. And the municipal manager was arguing that Ghana's real potential lies in tourism and being a world-class city, Accra, and if we remove people from the streets, it won't cause them hardship, it'll just clean the streets and everything will sort of be better. But then he admitted, he was being interviewed when I was there, he was sort of saying, but of course we had to abandon this because it was unfathomably unpopular, and because of COVID, we couldn't sort of cause more hardship. So he was then admitting that it was causing hardship. But basically that has been the burning issue where workers, not just through their associations, but also through their markets affiliations. Often these big markets do group together. There's something called the market queen, who's at the top of the sort of power structure. So a lot happens not just in worker-based organizations, but in market structures. They don't always win. There are battles that are lost, but there's a war going on to remove them from the streets. And at the moment it's Operation Clean Sweep, which I think was even funded by the World Bank, so it had some sort of international sort of power to it. But before Operation Clean Sweep, there was something else that was trying to get traders. And I think we know that from South African cities as well, right? The city of Johannesburg comes to mind. Remember during COVID that they were stealing, the Metro Police were stealing that woman's goods from the corner, and it was in the middle of COVID. We had other stuff to worry about, so why not focus on providing basic services rather than removing livelihoods as the priority? And we can see it in our own municipality as well, right? We could argue, I don't know if we'd agree, that we have some basic services issues, but the mayor and the police were checking expired goods in spaza shops a couple of weeks ago and making a big production about that being there. So it's the same type of dynamic that plays out in a lot of cities. But I would argue that the way they've demonstrated power most recently, whether through its different type of collective organizations, has been in pushing back on this Operation Clean Sweep, which is just the latest and perhaps most high-profile sort of policy to remove their livelihoods from public spaces. It's hard to gauge though, because there are wins and losses. It's a sort of a long-term thing. Yeah, I mean, another good question, and a two-parter this time. Most economically stable. So we definitely often refer to Ghana as democratically the most stable country in the region. I'm not sure by which metric we would call them the most economically stable. They have just had a bailout from the IMF, right? So it's not been a good year. In fact, I don't know if you guys read The Conversation. It's that online academic sort of public format for your publicly digestible format for research. The Conversation Africa editor put together a 4-part series called Ghana's Abysmal Year. Sort of summarized it wasn't just economic. They had an anti-LGBTQ bill that was put in parliament that was defeated, but it's just not been a great time for Ghana economically. It's GDP, it's the bailout, it's the e-levy, and obviously sort of inflation. But your second part, can we only rely on those 10%, right? And I think that's where it makes more sense rather than to say, my evidence says you should never tax the informal sector. I think what this shows is if you look at the top end, there might be room to tax the informal sector. But what type of tax design do you need that doesn't result in what I presented? Right? Because I think we can all agree that's not sustainable. That's not going to solve the problem. Right? One of the solutions or one of the approaches is to design a policy which reaches those top 20%, but still which understands that they earn 6,500 rand a month. So there's still a limit to how much you can tax even the highest sector. But I think the point is you can't design any policy until you know where you stand, right? What is the current, what's the outcome of the current tax system, right? It's got to be fair. I mean, this is why the World Bank says that is the only solution, right? Everyone just needs to pay that, and we need to tax luxury goods more. Right? And there's probably some logic to that if we can make that progressive instead of regressive. But yeah, the overall problem, whether it's fair or not to tax the 10% who are in the formal sector, but keep in mind some of them are also low earners in the formal sector as well. But yeah, that's the same problem exists in Ghana, despite its relative stability, low tax to GDP ratio, which no matter how you put it means you don't have enough money, right, in your revenue. Yeah, what's been the effect of Ukraine and Russia? I think the only direct thing would be inflation, right? The inflation started with the supply constraints, the cost of living crisis that's sort of peaked around the same time. I think March of 2022, so just over a year ago. The FAO said that the global food price index was the highest since records were kept. That coincided pretty much with the invasion of Ukraine and more or less the beginning of the inflation crisis in Ghana, but it's other things as well. But they certainly haven't been immune to the sort of knock-on effects of food prices from the invasion of Ukraine. And I think Jen makes asks an interesting question. What does that mean for South Africa? So at the moment, we don't have a presumptive tax regime. We don't have a specific tax like Ghana does for the informal sector. We know a lot about the informal sector in South Africa because we have one of the best, if not the best, labor force survey for a middle or developing income country. So we have a really good sense of what happens in our informal sector. As Lucian mentioned, we have a highly effective tax collection system. One of the strongest areas of government is SARS. So we have a much better tax to GDP ratio. And as I mentioned, we also have a much fairer tax system. Right? So how much of the informal sector, which I mentioned earlier, is 20% of the workforce in South Africa? How much of the informal sector do you think earns above the tax threshold of 80,000 a year? Yes. Yeah, I think way less than 5%, right? So our informal sector, I think government and SARS generally acknowledges is well below the tax threshold. What often happens has been experienced in the past is you can get more tax money out of the informal sector, but often it costs more to collect it than you get back. So I think SARS has quite rightly acknowledged that the informal sector pays through VAT in South Africa. Also, if you look at operating fees, informal sector operators, particularly in markets, already pay a number of these types of fees. Any municipal, like Joburg, a lot of those traders that were arrested during COVID had valid permits, so they were confused why they were being arrested with the permits that they were allowed to trade there. They paid for those permits and fees, so they do pay quite a bit already. And I think the sort of conclusion of SARS is the correct one, which is that given that they already pay VATs and earn well below the threshold and already pay a number of fees which should be written off as business expenses to operate, there's probably not anything to tax there. So Jen, that's the lesson.